The morning air in Sacramento carried that distinctive autumn crispness that made me think of my childhood in Napa Valley, the way the leaves would turn from green to amber before surrendering to gravity. But today, as I stood outside the courthouse, the chill had nothing to do with the season. My hands trembled slightly despite the leather gloves I'd put on to hide my nervousness. The marble steps of the federal courthouse gleamed under the pale October sun, each step feeling like a milestone in a journey I never wanted to take. Inside these walls, my life would change forever, and I had no idea just how dramatically. My name is Elena Rodriguez, and at 47 years old, I thought I knew everything about love, loyalty, and family. I was wrong. The automatic doors slid open with a soft whoosh, releasing a wave of heated air that smelled faintly of floor wax and old paper. My lawyer, Margaret Chen, stood just inside the security checkpoint, her expression unreadable behind those rectangular glasses that always made her look like she was analyzing something far beyond what the rest of us could see. "You're early," she said, checking her watch. "Court doesn't start for another 45 minutes. I couldn't sleep, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. Kept thinking about David. Margaret's shoulders relaxed almost imperceptibly. "We've prepared for every possibility, Elena. Whatever happens in there, remember that the truth is on our side." I nodded, though the words brought little comfort. The truth had become such a complicated thing lately, twisted and reshaped by the people I trusted most. The security process was methodical and impersonal. I placed my bag on the conveyor belt, walked through the metal detector, gathered my belongings, and followed Margaret down a corridor that seemed to stretch endlessly. The echo of our footsteps on the polished linoleum floor reminded me of hospital hallways, places where life-changing news was delivered with clinical detachment. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Margaret asked, stopping outside a heavy wooden door with a small brass plaque reading, "Courtroom 4B. I looked at my reflection in the glass panel of the door. My dark hair, usually pulled back in a neat bun, had started to frizz from the morning humidity. There were new lines around my eyes that hadn't been there 6 months ago, before everything fell apart. My mother's eyes, she used to say, though my mother had never faced anything like this. "I have to," I replied, straightening my blazer. "For the girls." Margaret nodded and pushed open the door. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, with wood paneling that glowed warmly under the recessed lighting. Rows of benches stretched back from the bar, and at the front, the judge's bench rose like an altar. Already, several people were seated, court clerks arranging papers, a stenographer setting up their machine, and on the opposite side of the room, my husband David with his lawyer. David didn't turn when we entered, but I felt his presence like a change in atmospheric pressure. 20 years of marriage does that. Creates a gravitational pull that defies distance and even animosity. His dark hair had more gray at the temples than when I'd last seen him a month ago, and his shoulders seemed broader in the expensive suit he'd bought just after he received his promotion at the bank. "Take a deep breath," Margaret whispered, guiding me to our table. "Remember what we discussed." I nodded, though my mind was racing with memories that had nothing to do with legal strategy. David and I had met in this very courthouse, of all places. We were both called for jury duty, ended up on the same panel, and spent 3 days listening to a complex fraud case that somehow led to discussions about our dreams over lunch breaks. By the time the judge dismissed us, we'd already made plans for dinner. "Your Honor," Margaret's voice pulled me back to the present, "we're ready to proceed." Judge Eleanor Williams, a woman in her late 60s with silver hair pulled into an elegant chignon, entered from her chambers. The room rose as one, the rustle of clothing like autumn leaves. I caught David's eye for the first time that morning, and what I saw there made my stomach clench. Not anger, not regret, but something colder, more calculated. "Please be seated," Judge Williams said, her voice carrying the authority of 3 decades on the bench. "We're here today to hear the matter of Rodriguez versus Rodriguez, regarding the dissolution of marriage and division of assets." The formal words hung in the air, clinical and sterile, belying the emotional devastation that had brought us here. 20 years reduced to a case number and legal terminology. "Ms. Chen, you may proceed with your opening statement." Margaret stood, adjusting her jacket. "Your Honor, my client Elena Rodriguez has been married to the defendant for 20 years. During that time, she supported his career advancement, raised their 2 daughters, and managed their household while also maintaining her own career as a nurse practitioner. 6 months ago, the defendant filed for divorce, claiming irreconcilable differences. However, we will demonstrate that this divorce filing coincides suspiciously with significant financial changes in the defendant's life, including the liquidation of joint assets and the opening of offshore accounts without my client's knowledge or consent. I felt my hands grow cold despite the warmth of the room. Offshore accounts. The word still sounded foreign, like something from a movie, not my life. "Mr. Peterson," the judge addressed David's lawyer, "your response." Robert Peterson, a man whose tailored suit probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment, rose smoothly. Your Honor, the defense will demonstrate that all financial decisions were made jointly and that my client has been transparent throughout the marriage. The unfortunate dissolution of this relationship is due to personal incompatibilities, not financial misconduct. David remained perfectly still, his hands folded on the table in front of him. I searched his face for some sign of the man I'd shared 2 decades with, the father of my children, the person who had held me through my mother's illness and celebrated my career achievements. But this David was a stranger, his features familiar yet arranged in an expression I couldn't read. Ms. Rodriguez, Judge Williams said, turning to me, do you understand that you are under oath in this courtroom? Yes, Your Honor. Then please tell the court, in your own words, why you believe your husband has engaged in financial misconduct during your marriage. I took a breath, the air catching in my throat. Margaret had prepared me for this moment, rehearsed questions and answers until I could recite them in my sleep. But now, faced with the formal setting and David's unwavering presence, the carefully constructed narrative felt fragile. Your Honor, I began, my voice steadier than I expected, David and I built our life together. When we married, we had nothing but student loans and dreams. We agreed that I would work part-time as a nurse while our daughters were young, then return to full-time practice once they were in school. David was just starting at the bank then, in the mortgage department. I paused, memories flooding back, the tiny apartment we'd shared, the way David would bring home pastries from the bakery near his office when he'd had a good day, how we'd celebrated every small raise or promotion as if it were a lottery win. Over the years, David's career advanced. He moved from mortgages to wealth management, then to private banking. With each promotion, our lifestyle improved, but we always agreed to save aggressively for the girls' education and our retirement. We had joint accounts, discussed major purchases, and made financial decisions together. Until when? The judge asked. Until about 8 months ago, I continued, my gaze drifting to David despite myself. That's when things started to change. David became more secretive about his work, working longer hours, taking business trips he'd never mentioned before. When I asked questions, he said I was being paranoid, that the stress of his new position was making him distant. The courtroom was silent, the only sound the soft were of the ventilation system. I could feel the weight of every person's attention, but it was David's reaction I was watching for. Still nothing, no emotion, no acknowledgement, just that unnerving stillness. Go on, Judge Williams prompted. In February of this year, David suggested we refinance our house to take advantage of lower interest rates. I signed the papers, trusting him completely. A week later, he told me he wanted a divorce. When I asked why, he said we'd grown apart, that we wanted different things. My voice cracked on the last words, the memory still raw enough to hurt. 20 years of marriage reduced to, we want different things. What did you discover after the divorce filing? Margaret asked, stepping closer to my table. I discovered that the refinancing hadn't been to lower our interest rate at all. David had taken out a home equity line of credit for $250,000. The money was gone, transferred to an account in the Cayman Islands. And that wasn't all. Our joint investment accounts had been liquidated, the funds moved to various offshore accounts. Even the girls' college funds had been drained. A murmur went through the few spectators in the courtroom. I kept my eyes on the judge, refusing to look at David, afraid of what I might see. Your Honor, Margaret said, we have bank records, transfer documents, and communications between Mr. Rodriguez and financial institutions that demonstrate a systematic transfer of marital assets to accounts held solely in his name, opened without Mrs. Rodriguez's knowledge or consent. Judge Williams examined the documents Margaret passed to her clerk. Mr. Peterson, your response? Peterson rose again, his movements fluid and confident. Your Honor, these transfers were indeed made, but with Mrs. Rodriguez's full knowledge and consent. The Rodriguez family had been planning to relocate to Costa Rica for several years. These offshore accounts were established in preparation for that move, with the full agreement of both parties. I felt as if the floor had dropped out from under me. Costa Rica? We had never discussed moving to Costa Rica. We had talked about buying a vacation home once the girls were in college, maybe in Hawaii or even back in my family's region of California, but never about relocating to another country. That's not true, I said, my voice louder than I intended. We never discussed moving to Costa Rica. David never mentioned anything about offshore accounts until after he filed for divorce. Judge Williams raised her eyebrows slightly. Mr. Peterson, do you have evidence of these alleged discussions about relocating? We do, Your Honor, Peterson replied smoothly. We have emails between Mr. and Mrs. Rodriguez discussing the move, as well as research about properties and schools in Costa Rica. We also have a signed document from Mrs. Rodriguez authorizing the establishment of these accounts. The clerk handed me a stack of papers. My hands shook as I looked through them. There were indeed emails that appeared to be from me, discussing Costa Rica with enthusiasm. There was a document with what looked like my signature, authorizing the transfer of funds to offshore accounts. But I had never written those emails, never signed that document. Those are forged, I said, my voice trembling with a mixture of anger and disbelief. I never wrote these emails. I never signed that document. David finally looked at me, and what I saw in his eyes made my blood run cold. Pity. He actually looked at me with pity, as if I were a child who couldn't understand something obvious. Elena, he said, his voice calm and reasonable, we both know you've been under a lot of stress. Maybe you don't remember everything clearly. The condescension in his tone was like a physical blow. Stress? Of course I was under stress. My husband of 20 years had suddenly decided to end our marriage while secretly transferring all our assets to hidden accounts. But that didn't mean I'd forgotten conversations about moving to Costa Rica that had never happened. Your Honor, Margaret said, stepping forward, we request a recess to examine these documents. Granted, Judge Williams replied. We'll reconvene in 1 hour. As we gathered our papers, David approached our table. His cologne, the same sandalwood scent he'd worn for 20 years, filled my senses with a confusing mix of memory and betrayal. Elena, he said, his voice low enough that only I could hear, don't make this harder than it needs to be. Just sign the settlement agreement and we can both move on. I looked up at him, really looked at him for the first time in months. The lines around his eyes were deeper than I remembered, his mouth set in a way that suggested he was holding back words he didn't want to say. For a fleeting moment, I saw the man I'd married, the one who used to leave love notes in my lunchbox, who would wake up early to make coffee just the way I liked it, who held my hand through 3 miscarriages before our daughters were finally born. Where is the money, David? I asked, my voice barely audible. Why would you do this to us? To the girls? His expression softened almost imperceptibly. It's not what you think, Elena. Just trust me one more time. Trust you? I couldn't keep the bitterness from my voice. You've drained our accounts, forged documents, and now you're asking me to trust you. He glanced around the courtroom, where a few people were still gathering their belongings. This isn't the place to discuss this. Meet me for coffee after the recess. There are things you need to know. Margaret appeared at my side, her presence a protective barrier. My client has nothing to say to you outside this courtroom, Mr. Rodriguez. David's eyes hardened. This doesn't concern you, Miss Chen. Actually, it does, Margaret replied coolly. As Elena's legal counsel, I'm present for all discussions regarding her case. David looked at me one last time, something unreadable in his expression. Think about what I said, Elena. One last conversation, no lawyers, no court. Just us. Then he turned and walked away, leaving me with the scent of his cologne and the bitter taste of betrayal. The conference room Margaret had booked for our recess was small and windowless, the air stale with the smell of old coffee and disinfectant. I paced the cramped space while Margaret examined the documents David's lawyer had presented. These emails are sophisticated forgeries, she said, pointing to various details on the printouts. The header information is manipulated, the timestamps don't match your usual email patterns. But they're good enough to create reasonable doubt. What about the signature? I asked, sinking into one of the uncomfortable chairs. Margaret held the document up to the light. It's a good copy, possibly traced from another document. A handwriting expert could challenge it, but that would take time and money we might not have. I rubbed my temples, a headache forming behind my eyes. What does this mean, Margaret? Can he really get away with this? The burden of proof is on us, she replied, her expression grim. David has created a narrative that makes him look like a responsible husband planning for his family's future, while casting you as either forgetful or unstable. It's a classic strategy in high-asset divorces. The injustice of it all made me feel sick to my stomach. 20 years of marriage, of building a life together, raising children, supporting each other through career changes and family crises, all reduced to a legal battle where truth seemed to matter less than strategy. What should we do? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Margaret sat across from me, her expression serious. We have 2 options. We can challenge these documents, bring in forensic experts to prove their forgeries. That will be expensive and time-consuming, with no guarantee of success. Or we can focus on the timing of these transfers. The fact that they occurred immediately before David filed for divorce suggests premeditation. I thought about our daughters, 16-year-old Sophia and 14-year-old Isabella. Sophia had just started thinking about college, her room covered in brochures from universities across the country. Isabella was still in that awkward phase between childhood and adolescence, needing the stability of home more than ever. How would I explain to them that their father had taken their college funds, that the life we'd built together was gone? David asked to meet me alone, I said, surprising myself with the words. No lawyers, just coffee. Margaret's eyebrows shot up. Absolutely not. That's exactly what he wants, to intimidate you, to manipulate you when you're vulnerable. Something's not right, Margaret, I insisted, standing up and pacing again. The David I know would never do something like this. There's more to this story. The David you know is the one who transferred $250,000 from your home equity line without telling you, Margaret reminded me gently. The David you know is the one who emptied your daughter's college funds. I know, I said, stopping to look out the small window at the brick wall of the adjacent building. But there was something in his eyes today. Not guilt, exactly, but something else. Margaret sighed, the sound heavy with concern. Elena, I've seen this happen too many times. Good, intelligent women like you, convinced that the husband who's betraying them couldn't possibly be capable of such deception. It's a form of denial, and it's dangerous in a situation like this. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something I was missing, some piece of the puzzle that would make sense of this nightmare. What if I meet him? I asked. Just to hear what he has to say. I don't have to agree to anything. Margaret shook her head. It's a terrible idea. He'll say whatever he thinks will get you to drop the case, to accept a minimal settlement. He's already demonstrated that he's not above forgery and deception. I thought about the 20 years we'd shared, the memories that couldn't be erased by legal documents or financial transactions. David holding my hand in the hospital when my mother was dying, staying up all night with me when Sophia had pneumonia as a baby, the way he'd surprise me with tickets to the symphony for our anniversary, even though he preferred baseball games. Please, Margaret, I said, my voice trembling. Just this once. I need to understand why. Margaret studied my face for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she nodded. Fine. But I'm coming with you, and I'm sitting at the next table. If he says anything that sounds like coercion or manipulation, we're leaving immediately. The coffee shop was just around the corner from the courthouse, a trendy place with exposed brick walls and the smell of roasted beans hanging in the air. David was already there, sitting at a small table in the corner, 2 cups of coffee in front of him. He'd ordered my favorite, a vanilla latte with an extra shot of espresso, just the way I liked it. The small gesture hit me harder than it should have, a reminder of the thousands of ways he'd shown his love over the years, the intimate knowledge of my preferences that had accumulated over 2 decades of marriage. Margaret, David said, nodding at my lawyer as she sat at the table next to ours. I asked to speak to Elena alone. And I'm not letting that happen, Margaret replied coolly, pulling out her tablet. But I won't interrupt unless you cross a line. David sighed, running a hand through his hair. Fine. Have it your way. He pushed the latte toward me. I remembered how you like it. I wrapped my hands around the warm cup, the familiar comfort of the ritual at odds with the circumstances. Why did you ask me to meet you, David? He looked around the coffee shop, his gaze lingering on a young couple laughing at a nearby table. Do you remember our first anniversary? We were so broke, we couldn't afford a nice dinner, so we bought a bottle of cheap wine and had a picnic in the park. I nodded, the memory vivid despite the years that had passed. We'd spread a blanket under the oak trees, shared the wine in paper cups, and talked about our future until the stars came out. I remember, I said softly. Do you remember what I promised you that night? David asked, his voice low. That you would always take care of me, I replied, the words bringing a lump to my throat. That we would build a life together, face whatever came at us as a team. I've tried to keep that promise, Elena, he said, his eyes meeting mine. Even when it meant doing things you wouldn't understand. Like stealing our money? Forging documents? I couldn't keep the anger from my voice. It wasn't like that, he insisted, leaning forward. I was trying to protect you and the girls. Protect us? I almost laughed. By draining our accounts and leaving us with nothing? How exactly is that protection? David looked around again, lowering his voice even further. There are things you don't know, Elena. Things about my work at the bank, about people I've gotten involved with. Margaret looked up from her tablet, her expression alert. Are you suggesting illegal activity, Mr. Rodriguez? David shot her an annoyed look. This is between me and my wife. Your ex-wife, Margaret corrected. And anything that affects the marital assets is definitely between you and her legal counsel. I took a sip of my latte, the sweet vanilla flavor doing little to calm my racing heart. What kind of things, David? What are you talking about? He hesitated, his fingers drumming nervously on the table. About a year ago, I was approached by some people at the bank. They had a special investment opportunity. High risk, high reward. They said it was the kind of thing that could set us up for life, ensure the girls could go to any college they wanted, that we could retire early. I felt a cold dread creeping up my spine. What kind of investment opportunity? David's eyes darted around the coffee shop again. Let's just say it wasn't entirely legal. Offshore accounts, shell corporations, the kind of thing the IRS frowns upon. I stared at him, the pieces starting to fall into place with horrifying clarity. You used our money for this? Our savings? The girls' college funds? It was supposed to be temporary, he insisted, his voice urgent. 6 months, a year at most. Then everything would be back to normal, but with enough profit to change our lives. And when it went wrong? I asked, though I already knew the answer. He wouldn't meet my eyes. It didn't go wrong exactly. But the people I was working with, they're not the kind of people you walk away from easily. So you decided to divorce me and keep all the remaining money for yourself? I asked, my voice shaking with a mixture of anger and disbelief. No, he said, a little too loudly. The couple at the next table glanced over at us. I needed to get the assets somewhere they couldn't be traced, somewhere the bank wouldn't know about. I was planning to come back for you and the girls once everything was settled. The absurdity of his explanation almost made me laugh. You were planning to come back? After divorcing me, draining our accounts, and forging documents to make it look like I agreed to everything. It was the only way I could think to protect you, he insisted. If your name wasn't on anything, you couldn't be implicated. You could honestly say you knew nothing about any of it. I looked at this man I had loved for 20 years, the father of my children, and saw a stranger, someone so caught up in his own deception that he actually believed he was protecting us by destroying our financial security. Who are these people, David? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. What kind of trouble are you in? He shook his head. I can't tell you that. The less you know, the better. Margaret spoke up from the next table. Mr. Rodriguez, are you admitting to financial misconduct that implicates your former employer? David stood up abruptly. This was a mistake. I shouldn't have said anything. Wait, I said, reaching for his arm. Don't go. We need to figure this out. He pulled away from my touch. There's nothing to figure out, Elena. Just sign the settlement papers. Take what they're offering and move on. It's better for everyone. Then he was gone, leaving me with a half-finished latte and more questions than answers. Margaret moved to my table, her expression grim. Well, that changes things. What do we do now? I asked, my mind reeling from David's confession. First, she said, pulling out her phone, we contact the district attorney's office. What David just described sounds like bank fraud, possibly money laundering. Second, we need to consider whether you want to continue with this divorce proceeding or if you want to wait until the criminal investigation plays out. The thought of David facing criminal charges made my stomach clench. Despite everything, a part of me still loved him, still remembered the man who had been my partner for 2 decades. Would he go to jail? I asked, my voice trembling. Margaret's expression softened. I can't say for sure, Elena. But if what he described is accurate, and if the bank discovers his activities, yes, there's a real possibility of prison time. I thought of our daughters, how they would react to their father being incarcerated. Sophia, already struggling with typical teenage angst, would likely shut down completely. Isabella, still so tender-hearted, would be devastated. Is there any way to protect him? I asked, hating myself even as the words left my mouth. Margaret sighed. The only way to protect him would be to continue with the narrative he's created, that you knew about and agreed to these financial arrangements. But that would mean perjuring yourself, and it would leave you and the girls with nothing. The choice felt impossible, a decision between protecting the man I had loved or protecting myself and our children. 20 years of marriage had created bonds that couldn't be easily severed, even by betrayal. As we walked back to the courthouse, my phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Sophia. Mom, how's it going? Is it almost over? I typed back quickly, not yet, sweetie. Everything's fine. How was school? The reply came almost immediately, boring. Dad said he might take us to dinner tonight to celebrate everything being over. I stopped walking, the message hitting me like a physical blow. David had already told our daughters that the divorce would be finalized today, that everything would be over. He hadn't mentioned any of the complications, any of the legal or criminal implications. What is it? Margaret asked, noticing my expression. I showed her the message. Her face hardened. He's trying to create a narrative that makes it harder for you to do anything but accept his version of events. But the girls, I said, my voice breaking. He's already gotten their hopes up. Margaret placed a hand on my arm. Elena, you need to decide right now what you're going to do in that courtroom. Are you going to challenge his story, potentially exposing him to criminal charges? Or are you going to let him get away with this to protect your family from the fallout? We stood on the courthouse steps, the October sun casting long shadows across the pavement. Inside those walls, I would have to make a choice that would determine not just my financial future, but the future of my entire family. Let's go back in, I said finally, my voice firmer than I felt. I know what I have to do. The courtroom felt different when we returned. The air seemed heavier, charged with the weight of what I had learned. David was already seated at his table, his expression composed as he spoke with his lawyer. When he saw me enter, our eyes met for a brief moment, and I thought I saw something like regret in his gaze before it was masked by the cool detachment he'd adopted since this all began. Judge Williams entered precisely when the clock read 2 o'clock, her movements efficient and practiced. The courtroom rose as one, the rustle of clothing like a collective intake of breath. "Ms. Chen," the judge said, "have you had sufficient time to review the documents presented by the defense?" "We have, Your Honor," Margaret replied, standing. "And we have additional evidence to present that contradicts the defense's narrative." Judge Williams nodded. "Proceed." Margaret approached the bench, her confidence palpable. "Your Honor, the defense has suggested that the financial transfers in question were made with Mrs. Rodriguez's full knowledge and consent as part of a plan to relocate the family to Costa Rica. We have now learned that these transfers were actually made as part of an illegal scheme that Mr. Rodriguez was involved with at his employment at First California Bank." A ripple of murmurs went through the courtroom. David's lawyer shot to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. There's no evidence to support these outrageous claims." Judge Williams raised her eyebrows. "Ms. Chen, do you have evidence to support these allegations?" "We do, Your Honor," Margaret said calmly. "During the recess, Mr. Rodriguez approached my client and admitted to participating in an illegal investment scheme involving offshore accounts and shell corporations. He claimed these actions were intended to protect the family, but in reality, they constitute bank fraud and money laundering." David's face had gone pale, his hands clenched into fists on the table. I could see the muscle working in his jaw, the rapid pulse beating in his neck. "Your Honor," Peterson interjected, "this is nothing more than a desperate attempt to divert attention from the fact that Mrs. Rodriguez consented to these financial arrangements and is now having second thoughts." "That's not true," I said, my voice clear and steady despite the tremor I felt inside. "I never consented to any of this. I never even knew about these accounts until after David filed for divorce." Judge Williams studied me for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "Mrs. Rodriguez, are you saying that your husband confessed to criminal activity during the recess?" "He did, Your Honor," I confirmed. "He said he was trying to protect me and our daughters by keeping my name off the accounts, but he never mentioned anything about Costa Rica until today." The judge turned to David. "Mr. Rodriguez, do you wish to respond to these allegations?" David stood slowly, his expensive suit suddenly looking too large on his frame. "Your Honor, I think there's been a misunderstanding. I did speak with my wife during the recess, but I think she may have misinterpreted what I said." "Is it or is it not true," the judge asked, her voice sharp, "that you transferred marital assets to offshore accounts without your wife's knowledge or consent?" David hesitated, his eyes darting around the courtroom as if searching for an escape route. "The transfers were made, yes, but with the intention of benefiting the entire family." "That's not what I asked, Mr. Rodriguez," Judge Williams said, her tone leaving no room for evasion. "Did you make these transfers without your wife's knowledge or consent?" The silence stretched, broken only by the soft hum of the ventilation system. I could see the sweat beating on David's forehead, the way his throat worked as he swallowed. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely audible. "Yes, Your Honor. I made the transfers without Elena's knowledge." A collective gasp went through the courtroom. Peterson's face had gone rigid with anger, though whether at David for admitting the truth or at me for exposing it, I couldn't tell. "Your Honor," Margaret said, stepping forward, "we request that these proceedings be stayed pending a criminal investigation into Mr. Rodriguez's activities." "Granted," Judge Williams replied immediately. "This court will not be used to facilitate financial misconduct. Mr. Rodriguez, you are hereby ordered to provide a complete accounting of all financial transfers made in the past 12 months. Ms. Chen, you will coordinate with the District Attorney's Office to ensure that Mrs. Rodriguez's interests are protected during the criminal investigation." As the judge spoke, I saw the color drain completely from David's face. He looked at me, and this time there was no mistaking the emotion in his eyes, pure, unadulterated panic. "Your Honor," Peterson said, "we object to this course of action. These are civil matters, not criminal. The transfer of $250,000 to an offshore account without the knowledge of one's spouse goes beyond civil matters, Mr. Peterson," Judge Williams replied sternly. "This court has a responsibility to ensure that justice is served, and that includes referring potential criminal activity to the appropriate authorities." She stood, signaling that the hearing was concluded. "We will reconvene in 30 days to determine the next steps in these proceedings. In the meantime, Mr. Rodriguez, I strongly advise you to seek legal counsel experienced in criminal defense." As the courtroom emptied, I remained seated, the reality of what had just happened slowly sinking in. David was being investigated for criminal activity. Our divorce proceedings were on hold. Our daughters would soon learn that their father was in serious legal trouble. Margaret gathered her papers, her movements methodical. That went better than I expected, honestly. The judge could have chosen to continue with the civil proceedings, but she seems to take financial misconduct seriously. What happens now? I asked, my voice hollow. Now, Margaret said, sitting beside me, we wait for the district attorney's office to contact us. They'll want to take your statement about what David told you during the recess. They may also ask you to testify before a grand jury. I thought of David's face when the judge mentioned criminal investigation, the fear, the panic. Despite everything he had done, a part of me still ached for him, still remembered the man I had loved for 2 decades. Will he go to jail, Margaret? I asked again, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. She sighed, her expression softening. It depends on many factors, the extent of his involvement, whether he cooperates with investigators, whether this is his first offense. But yes, Elena, there's a real possibility that he could serve time. The thought made me feel physically ill. David, who couldn't even kill spiders in the house, who cried during sentimental movies, who had always been the gentle parent to my stricter one, in prison. It seemed impossible, a nightmare from which I would eventually wake. I need to see him, I said, standing up. I need to talk to him before this goes any further. Margaret's expression was concerned. Elena, I don't think that's a good idea. Anything you say to him could be subpoenaed, and you don't want to put yourself in a position where you're accused of helping him. I just need 5 minutes, I insisted. To understand why. David was waiting for me just outside the courtroom, his lawyer beside him, speaking in low, urgent tones. When he saw me approaching, he held up a hand to silence Peterson. Elena, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Can we talk? Alone? Margaret stepped forward. Anything you have to say to my client can be said in front of me. David looked at the few people still lingering in the hallway. Not here. Please, Elena. Just 5 minutes. Against my better judgment, I nodded. The conference room we used earlier. The walk to the small windowless room was silent, the air thick with unspoken words. Once inside, David closed the door, his movements stiff and unnatural. I never meant for this to happen, he said, his back to me. I swear, Elena, I was trying to protect you. By stealing our money? By lying to me, to the girls? I asked, my voice shaking with anger and hurt. He turned to face me, and I was shocked by how much he had aged in the past few months. His face was haggard, with dark circles under his eyes and new lines etched around his mouth. It started small, he said, sinking into one of the chairs. A client at the bank mentioned an investment opportunity, something off the books, high risk but with incredible returns. I thought, what's the harm? A small investment, something that could give us the cushion we always talked about, the ability to retire early, travel like we've always wanted to. He paused, running a hand through his hair. At first, it worked. The returns were amazing, better than anything we could get through legitimate channels. I invested more, still keeping it small enough that you wouldn't notice. But I did notice, I said softly. I asked you about the discrepancies in our statements, and you said it was just bank fees, processing delays. David nodded, his shame palpable. I knew I should have stopped then, but the opportunity was too good to pass up. The people I was working with said they had bigger plans, that if I brought in more capital, the returns would be life-changing. So you took out the home equity line, I said, the pieces falling into place. It was supposed to be for 6 months, he insisted, his voice urgent. Just long enough to make the investment, double our money, and put everything back before anyone noticed. But something went wrong, I guessed. He stood up and began pacing the small room. The people I was working with, they're not just investors, Elena. They're connected to some dangerous organizations. When I tried to pull out, they made it clear that walking away wasn't an option. I felt a cold dread creeping up my spine. What kind of organizations, David? He stopped pacing and looked at me, his eyes filled with fear. I don't know exactly. Cartels, maybe? Money laundering operations? All I know is that they have ways of making people disappear, and they don't take kindly to people who try to back out of deals. The implications of his words were staggering. My husband, the mild-mannered banker who still got nervous speaking in public, had gotten involved with something far more dangerous than simple investment fraud. That's why you filed for divorce, I realized. That's why you moved the money to offshore accounts. You weren't trying to protect me from legal trouble, you were trying to distance yourself and our family from dangerous people. David nodded, his shoulders slumping with defeat. I thought if we were divorced, if your name wasn't on anything, they wouldn't see you or the girls as leverage. I was planning to disappear for a while, let things cool down, then find a way to get you all back. The absurdity of his plan was almost laughable. You really thought that would work? That these people wouldn't figure out you had a family? I didn't think, he admitted, sinking back into the chair. I was scared, Elena. I'm still scared. I looked at this man I had shared my life with for 20 years, and felt a complicated mix of emotions, anger at his deception, fear for his safety, and beneath it all, the lingering remnants of love that couldn't be easily erased. What do we do now? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Before he could answer, there was a knock on the door. Margaret's voice came through clearly. Elena, the district attorney's office is here. They want to take your statement. David's face went pale. Elena, please. You can't tell them everything. If these people think I'm cooperating with investigators. Then what? I asked, though I already knew the answer. He looked at me, his eyes filled with desperation. They'll kill me. And they might come after you and the girls too. The weight of his words settled over me like a physical burden. In trying to protect our family from financial ruin, David had exposed us to a danger far more severe. And now I had to choose between telling the truth and potentially endangering all of us, or lying to protect a man who had betrayed my trust in the most fundamental ways possible. The door opened before I could respond, revealing Margaret and a man in a dark suit who introduced himself as Detective Mark Reynolds from the Sacramento District Attorney's Office. His presence filled the small room, his professional demeanor a stark contrast to the emotional turmoil David and I were experiencing. Mrs. Rodriguez, Detective Reynolds said, his voice calm and measured, I understand you had a conversation with your husband during the recess. I need you to tell me exactly what was said. David's eyes pleaded with me, silent desperation written across his face. I could feel Margaret's supportive presence behind me, her hand resting gently on my shoulder. The choice I was about to make would have consequences that would ripple through our lives for years to come. Detective, I began, my voice steadier than I expected, this is a complicated situation. David told me some things that I think you need to know, but I'm concerned about the safety of my family. The detective's expression remained neutral, though I sensed a flicker of interest in his eyes. Safety concerns are always our priority, Mrs. Rodriguez. If you believe there's a threat to you or your children, we need to know about it immediately. David made a small sound of protest, but I held up a hand to silence him. My husband mentioned that he was involved with some dangerous people, that he was pressured into participating in illegal activities and that trying to withdraw from those activities could have serious consequences. Detective Reynolds pulled out a small notebook and pen. Can you be more specific about what kind of illegal activities we're discussing? Before I could answer, David spoke up, his voice trembling. I'll cooperate. I'll tell you everything you need to know, but you have to protect my family. That's the only condition. The detective looked from David to me, his expression unreadable. Cooperation is always appreciated, Mr. Rodriguez. But protection is something we discuss after we have all the facts. For the next hour, in a sterile interview room at the district attorney's office, David laid out the whole sordid story. It was worse than I had imagined, a complex web of money laundering, shell corporations, and connections to organized crime that had ensnared him gradually, like a spider's web that's almost invisible until you're completely caught. It started with a client named Carlos Mendez, David explained, his hands clasped tightly on the metal table between us. He was wealthy, well-connected, always looking for ways to maximize returns while minimizing taxes. He mentioned an investment opportunity that was completely off the books, something that could triple your money in 6 months. Detective Reynolds listened intently, occasionally making notes. And you didn't think this was suspicious? David shook his head. I'd been in banking for 15 years by then. I thought I knew how to spot legitimate opportunities versus scams. Mendez had accounts with us for years, always above board. This seemed like just another sophisticated investment strategy. But it wasn't, I said, the anger I'd been suppressing finally bubbling to the surface. It was illegal, and you knew it. David flinched at my tone. At first, I told myself it was just exploiting loopholes in the tax code, something wealthy people do all the time. By the time I realized it was actual money laundering, I was already in too deep. How much money are we talking about? Detective Reynolds asked. David named a figure that made me gasp. Nearly $5 million had passed through various accounts he'd set up, with approximately $800,000 remaining in offshore accounts that he now couldn't access without drawing attention to himself. And the people you were working with, the detective continued, who are they? David's hands shook as he described the network he'd become entangled with, not just Carlos Mendez, but a series of shadowy figures who communicated through encrypted messages and met in nondescript locations, never using their real names, never discussing business over the phone. They never threatened me directly, David explained, but there were stories, people who tried to walk away, who suddenly decided to retire early or move to another country. The implication was clear. The detective nodded, his expression grim. And when you tried to extract yourself from this situation, that's when you decided to file for divorce and move the money? I thought if Elena and I were divorced, if her name wasn't on anything, she and the girls would be safe, David said, his voice cracking with emotion. I was planning to disappear for a while, let things cool down, then find a way to reconnect with them. The flawed logic of his plan was staggering, but I could see the desperate fear that had driven him to such extreme measures. My husband, the man who balanced our checkbook to the penny, who researched major purchases for weeks before committing, had made a series of increasingly poor decisions out of sheer terror. As we left the district attorney's office, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parking lot. Margaret had arranged for us to meet at her office to discuss next steps, but I needed a moment alone with David first. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper as we stood beside our cars in the nearly empty lot. "Why didn't you trust me enough to ask for help?" David looked at the ground, his shoulders slumped with defeat. "I was ashamed, Elena. I'd gotten us into something I couldn't get out of, and I didn't want you to see me as a failure." "A failure?" I almost laughed. "David, you're the most successful person I know. You worked your way up from a teller to vice president at the bank. You provided for our family, gave our daughters opportunities one never had. How could you possibly think I would see you as a failure?" "Because I made one mistake after another," he said, finally looking at me. "And each mistake made it harder to admit the truth. By the time I realized how much trouble I was in, I thought it was too late to fix it. I thought about the 20 years we'd shared, the challenges we'd faced together, my mother's prolonged illness and eventual death, Sophia's learning disability in elementary school, the recession that had threatened David's job security. We had always faced these challenges as a team, supporting each other through the darkest times. We could have faced this together, I said, my voice thick with emotion. Whatever this is, we could have faced it together. David reached for my hand, his touch tentative. "I know that now. But it's too late, isn't it?" I looked at our joined hands, at the simple gold wedding band that I still wore despite everything. "I don't know what's too late anymore, David. But I do know that our daughters are about to go through something traumatic, and they need both of us to be there for them." Margaret's office was on the 15th floor of a downtown building with panoramic views of Sacramento and the American River winding through it. The contrast between the serene view outside and the chaos of our situation was jarring. "First things first," Margaret said, once we were settled in her conference room with cups of coffee that neither of us touched. "The district attorney's office is likely to offer David a deal in exchange for his cooperation. He has information they can use to build a case against the larger organization." "What kind of deal?" David asked, his voice hoarse. "Typically, reduced charges in exchange for testimony," Margaret explained. "Given that he's come forward voluntarily and has provided substantial information, there's a good chance he could avoid prison time, especially if he agrees to witness protection." "Witness protection?" I repeated, the words feeling foreign and frightening. "What does that mean?" "It means new identities, relocation to another part of the country, limited contact with anyone from your previous life," Margaret said gently. "It's a significant sacrifice, but it's often necessary in cases involving organized crime." I thought of our daughters, of Sophia's excitement about the upcoming prom, of Isabella's recent discovery of her passion for photography. How would we explain to them that their father might need to disappear, that we might never see him again? "There has to be another way," I said, my voice trembling. "David didn't choose this willingly. He was coerced, threatened." Margaret's expression was sympathetic but firm. "The legal system doesn't always distinguish between willing participants and those who were coerced, especially when financial crimes are involved. The fact that David profited from these activities, even temporarily, complicates his position." "What if I testify?" I asked suddenly. "What if I explain how he was trying to protect us?" David shook his head. "No, Elena. I'm not dragging you into this. I made these choices, and I'll face the consequences." The selflessness of his statement, coming after months of what I had perceived as selfish behavior, caught me off guard. This was the David I had married, the man who would always put his family first, even at great personal cost. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves," Margaret said, her voice practical. "The investigation is just beginning. It could be months before we know what charges, if any, will be filed. In the meantime, we need to focus on protecting the girls and maintaining as much normalcy as possible." Normalcy seemed like a distant dream as I drove home that evening, the setting sun painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Our house in the suburbs looked the same as it had this morning, the neat lawn, the flower beds I'd planted last spring, the welcome mat that still read, "The Rodriguez family," but everything had changed. The girls were in the living room, Sophia doing homework on the couch while Isabella scrolled through her phone at the kitchen table. They looked up when I entered, their expressions hopeful. "How did it go?" Sophia asked, her voice cautious. Is it really over? I looked at my daughters, Sophia, so much like David in her logical approach to problems, and Isabella, who shared my tendency to feel everything deeply, and wondered how I would explain the mess we were in without terrifying them. Can we talk in the living room? I asked, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside. There's something I need to tell you both. As we settled on the couch, the familiar comfort of our family room suddenly felt fragile, like a sanctuary that was about to be breached. I chose my words carefully, aware that this conversation would change their perception of their father forever. The court hearing didn't go exactly as planned, I began, taking both of their hands. Your father and I discovered some complicated financial issues that need to be resolved before the divorce can be finalized. Sophia's brow furrowed with concern. What kind of financial issues? Are we going to lose the house? No, sweetheart, I reassured her, squeezing her hand. The house is fine. But your father has been involved in some complicated business activities at work, and he's going to need some time to sort them out. Isabella's eyes widened with understanding. Is Dad in trouble? I took a deep breath, hating the fear I saw in my younger daughter's eyes. Your father made some mistakes at work, honey. Big mistakes. And now he's working with the authorities to fix them. Like criminal mistakes? Sophia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, unable to lie to them despite how much I wanted to protect them from this truth. Yes, honey. Criminal mistakes. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken questions. I could see the wheels turning in Sophia's mind, the logical teenager trying to process this new information about her father, the man she had always looked up to as her hero. Is he going to jail? Isabella asked, her voice trembling. I don't know, sweetie, I admitted, pulling her into a hug. But whatever happens, we're going to face it together as a family. Your father loves you both more than anything in the world, and everything he's done because he was trying to protect us. The explanation felt inadequate, a simplification of a much more complex reality, but it was the best I could offer them in that moment. The full truth, the money laundering, the organized crime connections, the possibility of witness protection, was too much for them to bear right now. Can we see him? Sophia asked, her voice small. Before anything happens? I nodded, relief washing over me that they weren't immediately rejecting their father. Of course. I'll arrange for us to meet him tomorrow. As I tucked them into bed that night, a ritual I hadn't needed to perform regularly for years, but one that felt necessary tonight, I thought about how quickly our lives had unraveled. 6 months ago, we had been a typical family navigating the challenges of work, school, and the occasional argument about screen time. Now, we were facing a crisis that would test us in ways I couldn't have imagined. Lying in bed that night, in the room I had shared with David for 20 years, I thought about the journey that had brought us to this point. The young couple who had stood before a judge and promised to love each other for better or for worse, in sickness and in health, had never imagined that worse would mean criminal investigations and potential prison sentences. But as I drifted off to sleep, I made a decision. Whatever happened next, we would face it as a family, broken, perhaps, and certainly changed, but still connected by the bonds of love and shared history that had sustained us through 2 decades of life together. The next morning dawned gray and overcast, matching my mood as I prepared for what would undoubtedly be one of the most difficult conversations of our lives. Margaret had arranged for us to meet David at a neutral location, a small park on the outskirts of town where we could talk without fear of being overheard. The girls were uncharacteristically quiet during the drive, both lost in their own thoughts. Sophia, ever the pragmatist, had spent the morning researching white-collar crime on her laptop, while Isabella had retreated into the comfort of her sketchbook, her drawings darker and more somber than usual. Are you mad at Dad? Isabella asked suddenly, breaking the silence that had settled over the car. I glanced at her in the rearview mirror, my heart aching at the sight of her troubled expression. I'm not mad, sweetie. I'm confused. And sad. And worried. But not mad. Because he was trying to protect us? Sophia asked, her voice analytical rather than emotional. That's part of it, I admitted, turning onto the highway that would take us to the park. But also because I know your father. I know the kind of person he is, and I know that whatever mistakes he made, they came from a place of love, even if his judgment was clouded by fear. The park was nearly empty when we arrived, the autumn chill keeping most people indoors. David was already there, standing by a small pond where ducks swam in lazy circles. He turned when he heard our approach, his face lighting up with a mixture of joy and pain at the sight of our daughters. The girls ran to him, their earlier concerns momentarily forgotten in the rush of parental affection. I watched from a distance, giving them a moment of normalcy before we had to face the difficult conversation ahead. As we sat on a bench overlooking the pond, David began to explain, his voice gentle but honest. He didn't sugarcoat the situation, but he also didn't burden them with details that would only increase their fear. I made some very bad choices at work, he said, his arm around Isabella while Sophia sat beside him, their shoulders touching. Choices that broke the law, and that I'm going to have to answer for. Are you going to jail? Sophia asked, her voice steady despite the tremor I could see in her hands. David took a deep breath before answering. I might have to, honey. But I'm working with the authorities to try to minimize that possibility. And if I do have to go away for a while, I promise you it won't be forever. What about us? Isabella asked, her voice small. What will happen to us? You'll stay with Mom, of course, David said, his voice thick with emotion. You'll go to school, you'll see your friends, you'll live your lives. And I'll be in touch as much as I can, whatever that looks like. Sophia, who had been quiet until now, finally spoke. Did you do it for the money? The directness of her question caught David off guard. He looked at our older daughter, really looked at her, and seemed to see not just a teenager asking about criminal motives, but a young woman trying to understand how her father could have betrayed the values he had spent her entire life teaching her. At first, David admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. At first, it was about the money, about providing more for our family, about securing our future. But by the end, it was about survival. About trying to find a way out of something that had become much bigger and more dangerous than I ever imagined. The honesty of his answer seemed to satisfy Sophia, who nodded slowly as if processing this new information about her father's fallibility. We're not mad at you, Dad, she said, taking his hand. We're scared, and we're sad, but we're not mad. Isabella echoed her sister's sentiment, burrowing closer to David's side. We love you no matter what. The simplicity of their forgiveness brought tears to my eyes. In their ability to separate the man from his mistakes, to love him despite his flaws, our daughters demonstrated a wisdom that adults often lose in the complexity of judgment and blame. As we left the park an hour later, the mood was somber but not hopeless. David had promised to keep us updated on the legal proceedings, and we had agreed to family counseling to help us navigate the difficult months ahead. The hardest part, David said as we said our goodbyes, will be not seeing you every day. Not being there for the small things, homework, dinner, bedtime stories. You'll still be our dad, Sophia said firmly. Even if you're not physically here, you'll still be our dad. The weeks that followed were a blur of legal meetings, counseling sessions, and attempts to maintain normalcy for the girls' sake. The district attorney's office formally charged David with money laundering and conspiracy to commit financial crimes, but they indicated they would recommend a reduced sentence in exchange for his cooperation against the larger organization. Margaret worked tirelessly to ensure that our family's interests were protected, negotiating with the bank to restore some of our lost funds and setting up trust accounts for the girls' education that David's criminal activities couldn't touch. Whatever happens, Margaret told me during one of our many strategy sessions, the girls will be provided for. The house is in your name, and we've managed to secure enough assets to ensure you can maintain your current lifestyle. But money had become the least of my concerns. What kept me awake at night was the emotional toll this was taking on our family, the way Isabella had started having nightmares, the withdrawn silence that had replaced Sophia's usual chattiness, the hollow ache in my own chest that refused to heal. The breaking point came 3 weeks after David's initial confession, when Detective Reynolds called to inform us that the DA's office was finalizing the plea agreement. They want David to enter witness protection, the detective explained over the phone. The organization he was involved with is more extensive and dangerous than we initially thought. His testimony will be crucial to our case, but it also puts him and anyone connected to him at significant risk. I felt the blood drain from my face. Witness protection? What does that mean for us? For our children? It means new identities, relocation, and limited contact with anyone from your previous life, Detective Reynolds replied, his voice sympathetic but firm. Given the nature of the organization David was involved with, we believe this is the only way to ensure his safety and, by extension, yours. The thought of David disappearing, of our daughters growing up without their father, was more than I could bear. But the alternative, the possibility that these dangerous people might come after our family, was even worse. That night, I sat the girls down and explained the situation as gently as I could. Their reactions were exactly what I had expected, Sophia's practical questions about logistics and timing, Isabella's silent tears and desperate clinging to my hand. When would he leave? Sophia asked, her voice carefully controlled. As soon as the plea agreement is finalized, I replied. Probably within the next 2 weeks. Where would he go? Isabella whispered, her voice barely audible. I don't know, sweetie, I admitted, pulling her into my arms. That's part of the protection, we won't know where he is, and he won't be able to tell us. The finality of that statement hung in the air between us, a stark reminder of how completely our lives were about to change. David's last night at home was bittersweet. We cooked his favorite meal, chicken enchiladas, the recipe he had learned from his grandmother and perfected over years of family dinners. The girls presented him with photo albums they had secretly created, filled with pictures from their childhoods and handwritten notes about their favorite memories. For a few hours, we managed to pretend that this was just another family dinner, that David wasn't leaving in the morning, possibly forever. But as the evening wore on, the reality of our situation became impossible to ignore. "I want you to know something," David said as we sat in the living room, the photo albums spread across the coffee table. "Whatever happens, wherever I end up, you three are the best thing that ever happened to me. The mistakes I made don't change how much I love you, or how proud I am of the family we've built." Sophia, who had been quiet throughout the evening, finally spoke. "We're proud of you too, Dad. For trying to make things right." Isabella crawled into his lap, a rare occurrence for my increasingly independent 14-year-old. "I'm going to miss you so much." David held her close, his eyes closed as if trying to memorize the feeling of his daughter in his arms. "I'll miss you too, sweetie. More than you can imagine." Later that night, after the girls were finally asleep, David and I sat on the back porch, the autumn chill wrapping around us like a shroud. "I never imagined it would end like this," he said, his voice barely audible in the darkness. 20 years of marriage, and this is how we say goodbye." "We're not saying goodbye forever," I replied, though I wasn't sure I believed it myself. "We're just pausing." He reached for my hand, his touch familiar despite the months of separation. "Do you think you could ever forgive me, Elena? Not just for the financial stuff, but for everything, the lies, the deception, putting our family in danger." I looked at the man I had loved for more than half my life, at the face that had aged 10 years in the past 6 months, and felt a complicated mix of emotions, anger at his choices, grief for what we had lost, but beneath it all, the enduring love that had sustained us through 2 decades of marriage. "I forgave you a long time ago, David," I said softly. "Not because what you did was okay, but because holding on to anger wouldn't change anything. We have a difficult road ahead, with or without you, and we need to face it with clear hearts." He squeezed my hand, his own trembling slightly. "I don't deserve you." "Maybe not," I agreed with a small smile. "But you have me anyway." The next morning, when the unmarked car arrived to take David away, the girls insisted on being there to say goodbye. The 3 of us stood on the front porch as David packed a small bag with the few belongings he was allowed to take, his wallet, a change of clothes, the photo albums the girls had made. "I love you all," he said, pulling us into a group hug that felt both too brief and infinitely long. "Remember that, no matter what happens." "We love you too," I replied, my voice thick with emotion. "Be safe." As the car drove away, Sophia wrapped her arm around my shoulders while Isabella clung to my hand. We stood there until the car was out of sight, 3 figures silhouetted against the morning light, a family incomplete but not broken. "What do we do now?" Isabella asked, her voice small. I looked at my daughters, at the strength and resilience they had shown throughout this ordeal, and felt a surge of hope for our future. "We go on," I said, pulling them close. "We go on together." The first months without David were a blur of adjustment and adaptation. The house felt impossibly large and quiet without his presence, the echoes of his footsteps in the hallway, the familiar sound of his key in the lock at the end of the workday, his laughter during our favorite television shows. Every corner held a memory, every room a ghost of what we had been. Sophia threw herself into her schoolwork with an intensity that both impressed and worried me. Her grades, always good, became exceptional, as if academic achievement could somehow fill the void her father's absence had left. She researched colleges with a focus on criminal justice, a choice that spoke volumes about how she was processing our family's trauma. Isabella, always more emotionally expressive, retreated into her art. Her sketchbooks filled with dark, haunting images, shadowy figures, broken chains, isolated houses against stormy skies. Her art teacher, concerned about the change in her work, called me in for a conference. "Isabella has always been talented," Mrs. Henderson said, spreading Isabella's recent drawings across her desk. "But this work is different. There's an anger, a pain in these pieces that's concerning for someone her age." I looked at the drawings, a father figure walking away into darkness, a family portrait with one face erased, a heart encased in barbed wire. "We've been through some difficult family changes recently," I explained, not wanting to betray David's confidence but needing to provide some context for Isabella's emotional state. "Whatever is happening," Mrs. Henderson said gently, "make sure she has someone to talk to. Art can be therapeutic, but it can also be a way of avoiding direct communication about painful feelings." The counseling sessions Margaret had arranged became our lifeline. Dr. Sarah Martinez, a family therapist with experience working with families affected by criminal proceedings, created a safe space for us to navigate the complex emotions we were experiencing. It's normal to feel a sense of loss, even when you're angry at the person who's gone, Dr. Martinez explained during one of our joint sessions. David wasn't just a husband and father who made mistakes. He was also the person who comforted you when you were sick, who celebrated your achievements, who was part of your daily routine. Losing that daily presence creates a void that needs to be acknowledged. For me, the void was most palpable in the evenings, after the girls were in bed and the house settled into silence. I found myself talking to David sometimes, sharing the details of my day as if he were still there to listen. "Isabella got an A on her science project," I said one night, sitting in the dark living room. "She was so proud, but she kept looking for you in the audience at the presentation. Sophia made varsity soccer, she's playing forward now, just like you always wanted." The silence that answered was a stark reminder of our new reality. David was gone, possibly forever, and we were left to pick up the pieces of our fractured family. The legal proceedings continued without our direct involvement. Detective Reynolds called periodically with updates. The plea agreement had been accepted, David had testified before a grand jury, several members of the criminal organization had been arrested based on his testimony. His cooperation was invaluable, the detective told me during one of these calls. He provided information that helped us dismantle a significant money laundering operation. The U.S. Attorney's Office has recommended a reduced sentence, but given the nature of his cooperation, witness protection is still the safest option. "Does he ever ask about us?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Every time we speak. He wants to know how the girls are doing, if you're okay, if you need anything." We've explained that direct contact isn't possible, but it doesn't stop him from asking. The knowledge that David was thinking of us, that he still cared despite everything, was both comforting and heartbreaking. We were living separate lives, connected only by memories and the occasional update from law enforcement. 6 months after David's departure, as spring began to replace the chill of winter, I received a letter with no return address. The envelope was plain white, the typing inside generic, but the content was anything but. "Dear Elena," it began, "I hope this letter finds you and the girls well. I'm writing to let you know that the legal proceedings are concluding. I've accepted a plea agreement that includes 3 years of supervised release and participation in a witness protection program. I won't be able to contact you directly during this time, but please know that I think of you every day." The letter went on to describe his new life in vague terms: a different city, a new job, the challenges of adjusting to an unfamiliar identity. But what caught my attention was the postscript. "I've arranged for a trust fund to be established for the girls' education. The bank has the details and will contact you about accessing it. It's not much, but it's what I could do to ensure they have the opportunities they deserve. Please tell them I love them, and that I'm proud of the strong young women they're becoming." I read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down my face. David, even in exile, was still trying to provide for us, still trying to be the husband and father he had always been, albeit from a distance. The girls' reactions to the letter were as different as their personalities. Sophia read it carefully, her expression analytical, then asked practical questions about the trust fund and what "supervised release" meant. "So he's not in jail?" she asked, relief evident in her voice. "No, sweetheart," I replied. "He's not in jail, but he can't come home either. It's a kind of in-between." Isabella's response was more emotional. She carried the letter with her for days, reading it over and over, as if the words could somehow bridge the distance between them. That evening, she added a new drawing to her collection, a bridge spanning a wide river, with figures walking toward each other from opposite sides. Summer arrived with its usual intensity, the Sacramento heat pressing down on us as we tried to establish new routines and traditions. We took a vacation to the coast, just the 3 of us, walking on the beach, collecting shells, and eating ice cream while watching the sunset. It was different from our family vacations of previous years, but not entirely without joy. "I miss Dad," Isabella said one evening as we sat on our hotel balcony, watching the waves crash against the shore. "But I'm having fun too. Is that okay?" I wrapped my arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "Of course it's okay, sweetie. Missing someone doesn't mean you can't also be happy. Your dad would want you to be happy." Sophia, who had been quietly reading nearby, looked up from her book. "I've been thinking about what Dad said in his letter, about being proud of the strong young women we're becoming. What does that even mean?" "It means you're facing a difficult situation with courage and resilience," I replied, my heart swelling with pride at the strength both girls had shown. "It means you're continuing to grow and learn and become amazing people, even when things are hard." "That's what Dad always said," Sophia mused. That character is what you do when no one is watching. The simplicity of her observation struck me deeply. David's character had been tested in the most extreme circumstances, and he had failed in many ways. But he had also taken responsibility for his actions, cooperated with authorities, and continued to care for his family from afar. Character, indeed, was what you did when no one was watching. As the new school year began, we settled into a rhythm that felt almost normal. Sophia, now a junior, was busier than ever with advanced classes, soccer, and her new position on the school newspaper. Isabella, starting high school, was finding her place through art classes and a small group of friends who shared her creative sensibilities. I had returned to work full-time at the medical clinic, the routine of nursing providing a welcome distraction from our complicated personal life. The financial settlement from the bank, combined with David's trust fund, had eased our immediate concerns about money, allowing us to focus on emotional healing rather than financial survival. One evening in October, exactly 1 year after the court hearing that had changed everything, Detective Reynolds called with unexpected news. "David's supervised release has been modified," he said, his voice holding a note of something I couldn't quite identify. "Given his cooperation and the successful prosecution of the case, he's been granted limited communication privileges." My heart raced. What does that mean? "It means he can send and receive letters through a secure channel," the detective explained. "They'll be screened for security purposes, but he'll be able to correspond with you and the girls directly." The possibility of direct communication, even in this limited form, was overwhelming. For a year, we had been living with the silence of David's absence, with only occasional third-hand updates to connect us to him. "I'll need to think about this," I said, my mind racing with implications and possibilities. "I need to discuss it with the girls." "Of course," Detective Reynolds replied. "Let me know what you decide. The channel will be available starting next month if you choose to use it." That night, as I sat with the girls at the kitchen table, I explained the detective's call. Their reactions were immediate and intense. "I want to write to him," Isabella said, her eyes bright with excitement. "I have so much to tell him, about starting high school, about my art class, about—" She trailed off, overwhelmed by the months of accumulated news she wanted to share. Sophia was more cautious. "Is it safe? I mean, if he's in witness protection, doesn't that mean people are looking for him?" The detective said it would be a secure channel, I explained. The letters would be screened to ensure no one could track him through them. "Then I want to write too," Sophia decided. "I have questions about what happened, about why he made the choices he did. I think I deserve some answers." The decision was made. We would establish this fragile connection with David, accepting the risk that came with it in exchange for the possibility of healing some of the wounds his absence had created. Our first letters were carefully composed, each of us writing separately but sharing our drafts with each other for feedback. Isabella's was filled with descriptions of her daily life, with questions about David's new home and whether he was happy. Sophia's was more analytical, asking specific questions about the legal proceedings and the criminal organization he had been involved with. My own letter was the most difficult to write. How do you summarize a year of life in a few pages? How do you express the complex mix of anger, forgiveness, love, and loss that had defined our separation? "Dear David," I began, the words feeling both foreign and familiar. "A year has passed since the court hearing that changed everything. In some ways, it feels like yesterday, in others, it feels like a lifetime ago. The girls are growing into amazing young women, strong, resilient, compassionate. They miss you every day, as do I, but we're also finding ways to be happy, to build a new version of our family that includes you even in your absence." I went on to describe our lives, Sophia's academic achievements, Isabella's artistic development, my return to work. I shared memories of our time together, acknowledging both the good and the bad. And I asked the questions that had been weighing on my mind. Do you ever regret the choices that led us here? Do you think about what might have been if you had trusted me enough to ask for help? Most importantly, are you safe, are you well, and are you finding a way to be at peace with what happened? 3 weeks after we sent our letters, we received responses. The envelopes were plain white, similar to the one I had received months ago, but this time there were 3 of them, each addressed in familiar handwriting. Isabella opened hers first, her hands trembling with excitement. David's letter to her was warm and encouraging, filled with questions about her art and her friends, with reassurances of his love and pride. "You sound so happy in your letter," he wrote. "That makes me happier than you can imagine. Please keep drawing, keep creating, keep sharing your unique view of the world with others. Your art has always been special, but it seems to have become even more meaningful this past year." Sophia's letter was more substantive, addressing her questions directly while maintaining the boundaries necessary for his protection. "Yes, I regret the choices that brought us here," he wrote. "Every day. But regret doesn't change the past, and dwelling on it doesn't help anyone move forward. What I can tell you is that the organization I was involved with was sophisticated and dangerous, and that getting out required extreme measures. The legal proceedings were complicated, but my cooperation helped dismantle an operation that was hurting many people. My letter was the longest, the most emotionally charged. David's response was honest and vulnerable, acknowledging his mistakes while also sharing something of his new life. I live in a small city now, far from Sacramento, he wrote. I work in a bookstore, which seems ironic given that I spent 20 years in banking. I have a small apartment overlooking a park, and I spend my evenings reading and writing letters I can't send. The loneliness is sometimes overwhelming, but I find comfort in knowing that you and the girls are safe and moving forward with your lives. As for your questions, he continued, yes, I regret not trusting you enough to ask for help. My pride and fear created a prison long before the legal system did. And yes, I think about what might have been, what could have been if I had made different choices. But I also try to focus on what is, a family that continues to love and support each other despite the distance between us. The letters became a monthly ritual, a fragile connection across the miles that separated us. We shared our lives in carefully chosen words, respecting the boundaries that kept David safe while maintaining the emotional intimacy that had sustained our marriage for 2 decades. Winter arrived with its usual gray skies and occasional rain, but the holiday season felt different this year. Without David's presence, the traditions we had established over 2 decades seemed hollow, the memories of previous celebrations tinged with sadness. On Christmas morning, as the girls opened their presents, I found myself wondering where David was, how he was spending this day that had always been so special to our family. As if reading my thoughts, Sophia paused in her unwrapping. Do you think Dad got our letters? She asked, referring to the holiday cards and updates we had sent weeks ago. I hope so, I replied, though I knew there was no guarantee that the letters had reached him in time for the holiday. Isabella disappeared into her room, returning with a small wrapped box. This is for Dad, she said, placing it under the tree. When he comes back. The simple faith in her statement brought tears to my eyes. After everything that had happened, our younger daughter still believed in the possibility of David's return, still held on to the hope that our family would one day be whole again. Sophia, ever the realist, placed a hand on her sister's shoulder. It might be a long time, Izzy. You know that, right? I know, Isabella replied, her voice firm. But he's still our dad, and this is still his family. The simplicity of her wisdom struck me deeply. Family wasn't about physical proximity or shared spaces, it was about connection, about love that transcended distance and circumstances. David might be gone, but he was still part of our family, still present in our memories, our conversations, and the letters that connected us across the miles. As winter gave way to spring, marking 18 months since David's departure, we received unexpected news. Detective Reynolds called to inform us that the criminal organization David had testified against had been successfully dismantled, with key members convicted and sentenced. David's cooperation was crucial to the case, the detective explained. The U.S. Attorney's Office has recommended a modification to his supervised release terms that might allow for more flexibility in communication, possibly even limited visitation under controlled circumstances. The possibility of seeing David again, of touching him, of hearing his voice in person rather than through the filtered medium of letters, was overwhelming. After more than a year of separation, the thought of reunion brought both excitement and apprehension. What does this mean, exactly? I asked, my heart racing. It means that in the next few months, arrangements might be made for you and the girls to visit David in a secure location, Detective Reynolds replied. The details would need to be carefully coordinated to ensure everyone's safety, but it's a possibility that wasn't on the table before. After I hung up the phone, I sat at the kitchen table, the news slowly sinking in. The girls would be home from school soon, and I would need to tell them that their father, the man who had been absent from their daily lives for over a year, might soon be more than just words on a page. The thought of reunion brought a complicated mix of emotions, joy at the possibility of seeing David again, fear about what he might look like after so long, anxiety about how the girls would react, and a lingering residue of anger and hurt that hadn't completely healed despite the passage of time. As I prepared dinner that evening, the familiar routine of chopping vegetables and seasoning meat providing a comforting anchor in the sea of uncertainty, I thought about the journey that had brought us to this moment. 20 years of marriage, 2 decades of building a life together, raising children, creating a home, all of it had been tested in ways I never could have imagined when I stood beside David at the altar and promised to love him for better or for worse. The worse had been more challenging than I could have anticipated, but it had also revealed strengths in myself and our daughters that I might never have discovered otherwise. We had faced the unthinkable and survived, not just survived but found ways to thrive, to create a new version of family that was different but not lesser than what we had before. When the girls came home, their chatter about school and friends filling the house with life, I knew that whatever the future held, we would face it together, a family tested by adversity but strengthened by love, forever connected by the bonds that distance and circumstance could not break. The waiting period between Detective Reynolds' call and the actual arrangements for our visit with David stretched into 3 long months. Spring gave way to summer, the Sacramento heat intensifying as our anticipation grew. Each day brought a mixture of hope and anxiety, hope that we would soon see David, anxiety about how that reunion would actually unfold. The letters continued to arrive monthly, each one carefully screened before reaching us. David's correspondence had gradually shifted from the formal distance of his early letters to a more intimate tone that hinted at the possibility of future connection. "I've been thinking a lot about our first apartment," he wrote in one letter. "The one with the leaky faucet and the neighbor who played opera at all hours. Do you remember how we used to lie in bed at night and try to guess which opera was playing? I never knew anything about classical music before I met you." His memories of our early life together, before careers and children and mortgages had complicated our existence, felt like a bridge across the chasm of his absence. I found myself revisiting those memories too, the simplicity of our early marriage a stark contrast to the complexity of our current situation. Sophia's letters had become increasingly focused on understanding the circumstances that had led to David's downfall. Her analytical mind, combined with the emotional maturity she had developed over the past year and a half, created a thoughtful correspondence that went beyond typical teenage concerns. "I've been reading about white-collar crime in my economics class," she wrote in one letter. "The professor talked about how good people can make bad decisions when they're under pressure, especially when they think they're protecting their families. Is that what happened to you, Dad? Did you really think you were protecting us?" David's response was characteristically honest. "That's the complicated part, Sophia. At first, I told myself I was doing it for us, for the security, the opportunities, the future I wanted to provide. But somewhere along the way, it became about ego, about proving I was smart enough to get away with something. The lines between protection and self-interest got blurred until I couldn't tell the difference anymore." Isabella's letters remained focused on the emotional aspects of their separation, her artistic sensibility creating vivid descriptions of her daily life that allowed David to visualize the world he was missing. "We went to the beach yesterday," she wrote in June. "The sky was that perfect California blue that you always said was your favorite color. I took pictures of the waves, trying to capture the way the sunlight hits the water just before it breaks. Remember how you used to say the ocean was the only thing big enough to hold all our worries?" Her ability to find beauty in the world, to maintain her creative spirit despite the challenges she faced, made my heart swell with pride. David's responses to her letters were filled with pride and encouragement, his words serving as a surrogate for the physical presence he couldn't provide. Finally, in late July, Detective Reynolds called with the details we had been waiting for. "The arrangements have been made," he said, his voice professional but with an undercurrent of something that sounded like understanding. "You'll be flying to Denver next Friday. A secure vehicle will pick you up at the airport and take you to a location where you can meet with David for 4 hours. All travel expenses will be covered, and you'll need to follow specific security protocols." The reality of the meeting hit me with full force. We would actually see David, touch him, hear his voice in person after more than a year and a half of separation. "Are there any restrictions on what we can discuss?" I asked, my mind already racing with questions and concerns. "David will have been briefed on what he can and cannot share," Detective Reynolds replied. "As for you and the girls, just be yourselves. He's been looking forward to this as much as you have." The week leading up to our trip was a flurry of activity and emotion. The girls and I shopped for new outfits, a simple act of normalcy that felt momentous under the circumstances. We packed and repacked our bags, each of us trying to anticipate what we might need for this unprecedented reunion. The night before our flight, sleep was elusive. I found myself wandering through the house, touching objects that held memories of David, the worn recliner where he used to read to the girls, the coffee mug with the chipped handle that he refused to throw away, the framed photograph of our family vacation to Yosemite that still sat on his bedside table. In Isabella's room, I found her arranging and rearranging the small collection of items she planned to show David, her most recent sketchbook, a photograph of the soccer team Sophia now captained, a seashell she had found on our summer beach trip. "Do you think he'll like it?" she asked, holding up the sketchbook. "I've been working on a series of drawings about connection, bridges, hands touching, things like that." "I think he'll love it," I replied, my heart aching at the thoughtfulness of her preparation. "He's missed so much of your artistic development. This will help him catch up." Sophia's preparations were more practical. She had a list of questions written in a notebook, topics she wanted to cover during their limited time together. I want to understand the timeline, she explained when I asked about her preparations. When did he first realize he was in trouble? Why didn't he reach out sooner? What could he have done differently? I'm not trying to blame him, she added quickly, but I need to understand. The flight to Denver the next morning was quiet, each of us lost in our own thoughts. The girls, who usually chattered nonstop during flights, were uncharacteristically silent, their faces turned toward the windows as if the clouds outside held the answers to questions they hadn't yet articulated. A man in a dark suit holding a sign with our last name met us at the airport. He introduced himself simply as Agent Thompson and led us to a black SUV with tinted windows. The drive is about an hour, he said, his voice neutral. There are some refreshments in the back if you need anything. The journey through Denver and into the surrounding mountains felt surreal, the familiar act of traveling transformed by the extraordinary circumstances of our trip. The girls watched the landscape change from urban to rural, their expressions reflecting a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. We finally turned onto a private road that led to a secluded cabin surrounded by pine trees. As the SUV stopped, Agent Thompson turned to face us. David is inside, he said. You have 4 hours. I'll be here to drive you back to the airport when your time is up. Remember, no photographs, no recording devices, and no discussion of specific locations or identifying details about David's new life. The walk to the cabin door felt like the longest I had ever taken. Each step brought me closer to a reunion I had both anticipated and dreaded for months. The girls held my hands, their palms sweaty with nervousness. I knocked on the door, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure they could hear it inside. When the door opened, revealing David for the first time in over a year, the world seemed to stop. He looked different, thinner, with new lines etched around his eyes and mouth, his hair more gray than I remembered. But it was undoubtedly David, my husband, the father of my children, the man I had loved for more than 2 decades. For a moment, we all just stood there, staring at each other across the threshold that separated his new life from our old one. Then Isabella broke the spell, running into his arms with a cry that was part joy, part relief, part sorrow for all the time they had lost. David hugged her tightly, his eyes closed as if trying to memorize the feeling of holding his daughter again. Sophia approached more cautiously, her analytical nature warring with the emotions that clearly overwhelmed her. You look different, she said, her voice carefully controlled. David released Isabella and opened his arms to Sophia. I feel different, he admitted, pulling both girls into a group hug. But seeing you both makes me feel more like myself than I have in months. I stood back for a moment, watching this reunion that was both heartbreaking and beautiful. David finally looked at me, his eyes filled with a complicated mix of emotions, love, regret, hope, fear. Elena, he said, his voice thick with emotion. You look beautiful. I stepped into his embrace, the familiar feeling of his arms around me both comforting and disorienting after so long apart. He smelled different, not the sandalwood cologne he had worn for 20 years, but something more subtle, more anonymous. You look tired, I whispered into his shoulder, the words an inadequate description of the changes I saw in him. I am, he admitted, releasing me but keeping his hands on my arms as if afraid I might disappear. But seeing you all makes me feel more alive than I have in months. The cabin was simply furnished but comfortable, with large windows that overlooked the mountains. A small dining table was set with refreshments, lemonade, cookies, fruit, as if for a normal family visit rather than this extraordinary reunion. For the first hour, we talked about safe topics, the girls' school experiences, my work at the clinic, David's new job at the bookstore. The conversation was stilted at times, filled with the awkwardness that comes from long separation, but gradually we found a rhythm that felt almost normal. Isabella finally brought out her sketchbook, her hands trembling slightly as she showed David her latest work. He examined each drawing carefully, his expression thoughtful. These are incredible, Izzy, he said, his voice filled with genuine pride. The way you use light and shadow, the emotion in these faces, you've developed so much as an artist. Isabella's art teacher entered one of her pieces in a regional competition, I added. She won first place. David's eyes widened with surprise and delight. That's amazing. Why didn't you tell me in your letters? Isabella shrugged, suddenly shy under his praise. I wanted to show you in person. Sophia, who had been quietly observing, finally spoke. I have some questions, if that's okay. David nodded, his expression serious. Of course, Sophia. Ask me anything. Her questions were thoughtful and precise, reflecting months of careful consideration. When did you first realize you were in real trouble? Not just financial trouble, but actual danger. David took a deep breath before answering. About 6 months before I filed for divorce. There was a meeting, they wanted me to move larger amounts of money, to use my position at the bank to access accounts that should have been off limits. When I hesitated, one of them made a comment about my family, about how important it was to keep loved ones safe. The casual cruelty of his words sent a chill through me. The threat hadn't been explicit, but it had been clear enough to terrify David into compliance. "Why didn't you tell me?" Sophia asked, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. "Why didn't you trust us to help you?" David looked at each of us in turn, his expression filled with regret. "That's the question I've asked myself every day for the past year and a half. I think I was ashamed. I had always been the one who solved problems, who protected our family. Admitting that I was in over my head felt like a failure I couldn't face." "And the money?" Sophia continued, her journalistic instincts taking over. "The accounts, the transfers, was any of it actually for us?" "Some of it, initially," David admitted. "The first transfers were meant to be temporary investments that would benefit all of us. But as things got more complicated, as the threats became more serious, the focus shifted to creating an escape fund, something that would allow me to disappear if necessary." The honesty of his answers, though painful, was somehow healing. By acknowledging his mistakes without excuse or deflection, David was taking responsibility in a way that went beyond the legal requirements of his cooperation with authorities. As the afternoon wore on, the conversation became more personal, more emotionally intimate. We shared memories of our life together, acknowledging both the joy and the pain of our shared history. "Do you remember our 10th anniversary?" I asked, the memory surfacing unexpectedly. "That surprise trip to Napa you planned, the bed and breakfast with the incredible view of the valley?" David smiled, the expression transforming his face, making him look more like the man I had married. "You hated that I didn't tell you where we were going. You were convinced I had forgotten our anniversary until I handed you the plane tickets at the airport. You packed my bags for me, I remembered. Including that red dress I loved but never had an occasion to wear. We danced under the stars that night," David said, his voice soft with memory. "At that restaurant with the outdoor patio. You said it was the most romantic night of your life." The girls watched us, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and wonder. They had heard stories of our early marriage, of the romance that had led to their existence, but seeing us reminisce together made those stories real in a way that letters and photographs never could. As our time together drew to a close, the mood became more somber. The reality that this reunion was temporary, that we would soon be separated again, hung over us like a cloud. "I don't want to go," Isabella said, her voice small as she clung to David's arm. "Can't you come home with us?" David knelt in front of her, his expression gentle but firm. "Oh, sweetie, you have no idea how much I want to come home with you. But it's not safe yet. Maybe someday, but not now." "When?" Sophia asked, her voice practical but tinged with hope. "Is there a timeline? Something we can look forward to?" David looked at me, his eyes asking a question I couldn't quite interpret. "The legal proceedings are almost complete," he said carefully. "My cooperation has been helpful, and there's a possibility that the terms of my release might be modified further in the future. But there are no guarantees." The ambiguity of his answer was disappointing but not surprising. We had learned to live with uncertainty over the past year and a half, and this was just another form of that uncertainty. Agent Thompson knocked on the door precisely 4 hours after our arrival, his presence a reminder that this extraordinary visit was coming to an end. The goodbyes were tearful and rushed, the 4 hours we had been given feeling insufficient after so many months apart. David hugged each of us tightly, whispering words of love and encouragement that we would carry with us back to Sacramento. "I'll write as soon as I can," he promised as we stood at the door. "Tell me everything, the small details, the daily things. I want to feel like I'm still part of your lives." "You are," I assured him, my heart aching with the impending separation. "You always will be." The drive back to the airport was quiet, each of us lost in our own thoughts. The girls leaned against me, their presence a comfort as we processed the emotional intensity of the reunion. "It was weird seeing him," Sophia said finally, breaking the silence. "He looked like Dad, but he also looked like a stranger." "I know what you mean," I replied. "Time changes people, and these circumstances have changed him more than most." "Did you still love him?" Isabella asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "When you saw him again?" The question caught me off guard, not because I hadn't considered it myself, but because I wasn't sure I had a simple answer. "It's complicated," I finally said, choosing my words carefully. "I'll always love the man I married, the father of my children. But we've both changed, and the circumstances of our separation, they've created a distance that might be too great to cross, even when he's finally able to come home." Sophia nodded thoughtfully. "So you might not get back together, even when this is all over?" "I don't know," I admitted. "I think we need to take this one day at a time, see what happens when the legal issues are resolved. Right now, we're focused on maintaining our connection, on being a family despite the distance between us." The flight home was quieter than the flight out, the emotional intensity of the reunion leaving us all exhausted. As the plane descended toward Sacramento, I thought about the unexpected turns our lives had taken, the ways in which crisis had revealed both our vulnerabilities and our strengths. Whatever the future held, we would face it as a family, not the traditional family we had once been, perhaps, but a family nonetheless, connected by love that transcended distance and circumstances, bound by the shared history that had shaped us all. The return to our daily routine after visiting David felt both comforting and disorienting. The house that had gradually begun to feel like ours alone now seemed haunted by his presence, the memory of his embrace, the sound of his voice, the sight of his face after so long apart creating a new layer of complexity in our already complicated lives. The girls processed the reunion in their characteristic ways. Sophia, ever analytical, created a timeline of David's story as she now understood it, cross-referencing his account with information from her economics class and independent research about financial crimes. "It makes sense in a twisted way," she explained one evening as we sat at the kitchen table, her notes spread around us. The gradual escalation, the way he rationalized each decision, the point at which he realized he was in too deep to back out easily. It's a classic pattern. The clinical detachment of her analysis couldn't quite hide the emotional undercurrent, the need to understand, to make sense of something that had fundamentally disrupted her understanding of her father and the world. Isabella's processing was more emotional, more artistic. She spent hours in her room, emerging occasionally with new drawings that captured the complexity of her feelings, images of reunion and separation, of connection across distance, of family reconfigured but not broken. "I'm working on a series called 4 Hours," she explained one afternoon, showing me a collection of sketches that depicted our time with David in the cabin. Each drawing represents 1 hour of our visit. This one is the first hour, when we were all awkward and hesitant. This one is when I showed him my sketchbook. This one is when we were talking about our anniversary trip to Napa. Her ability to translate emotional experience into art continued to amaze me, providing a window into her inner world that words alone couldn't capture. My own adjustment was more complicated. The reunion had reopened wounds that had begun to heal, creating a fresh wave of grief for the life we had lost alongside the joy of seeing David again. I found myself replaying our conversations, analyzing his expressions, searching for clues about our future that might or might not exist. The letters that had been our primary connection with David now took on new significance. When the first one arrived after our visit, 3 weeks to the day after our return, I opened it with a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. "Seeing you all was both the best and hardest thing I've experienced since I left," he wrote. "Best because it reminded me of everything I'm fighting to get back to. Hardest because leaving you again was more painful than I can express. I keep replaying those 4 hours in my mind, Isabella showing me her artwork, Sophia's thoughtful questions, the way you looked when you first saw me." His letter went on to share more details about his new life, carefully worded to maintain the security of his location while still giving us a window into his daily existence. "I work at a small independent bookstore now," he wrote. "It's ironic, I think. I spent 20 years moving money through complex financial systems, and now I spend my days organizing books by author and genre, helping customers find the perfect novel, recommending stories that might change their lives the way certain stories have changed mine." The letters became our primary way of processing the reunion, each of us sharing our feelings and reactions in our own correspondence. The girls' letters continued to focus on their daily lives and accomplishments, but now they were colored by the recent visit, references to conversations we had had, memories we had created together. As autumn arrived, marking 2 years since David's initial departure, we settled into a new rhythm that incorporated both his absence and the possibility of future connection. The girls continued to thrive. Sophia, now a senior, was excelling academically and had been accepted to several colleges, while Isabella's artwork had been selected for a statewide exhibition. I had advanced to a supervisory position at the clinic, the increased responsibility and salary providing a sense of stability that had been lacking during the tumultuous period following David's departure. We were building a life that was full and meaningful, even with the empty space David's absence had created. In October, Detective Reynolds called with unexpected news. The criminal case that David's testimony had helped build had concluded successfully, with all key members of the organization convicted and sentenced. Given the successful outcome and David's continued cooperation, the U.S. Attorney's Office has recommended a significant modification to his supervised release terms, the detective explained. He might be eligible for relocation to a less restrictive environment, possibly even eventual return to Sacramento under specific conditions. The possibility that David might actually come home, that our separation might be temporary rather than permanent, was overwhelming. For 2 years, we had been living in a state of limbo, adjusting to his absence while maintaining a connection that defied distance and circumstances. Now, the prospect of actual reunion brought both excitement and apprehension. What would this mean, exactly? I asked, my heart racing. In practical terms? It would mean a gradual transition, Detective Reynolds replied. Initially, more flexibility in communication and visits. Eventually, possibly, a return to the area under a new identity with certain security protocols in place. It wouldn't be an immediate return to your previous life, but it would be significantly less restrictive than his current situation. After I hung up the phone, I sat at the kitchen table, the news slowly sinking in. The girls would be home from school soon, and I would need to tell them that their father, the man who had been absent from their daily lives for 2 years, might soon be more than just a monthly letter and occasional supervised visit. The thought of David's return brought a complicated mix of emotions, joy at the possibility of our family being whole again, fear about how we would navigate the transition, anxiety about whether we could overcome the hurt and betrayal that had led to his departure. When the girls came home, their chatter about school and friends filling the house with life, I knew that whatever the future held, we would face it together, a family tested by adversity but strengthened by love, forever connected by the bonds that distance and circumstances could not break. That evening, as we sat around the dinner table, I shared the detective's news. Their reactions were immediate and intense. Does this mean he could come home? Isabella asked, her eyes wide with hope. Not right away, sweetie, I explained carefully. It would be a gradual process, with lots of rules and restrictions. But eventually, yes, it's possible that he could come back to Sacramento. Sophia's response was more measured. What would that look like? Would he live with us? Would he go back to banking? How would we explain his absence to people? Those are all good questions, I replied, impressed by her practical approach to the news. We don't have all the answers yet. The detective said it would be a gradual process, and we'd have time to figure things out as we go. The possibility of David's return became the new focus of our conversations with him. His letters took on a different tone, more forward-looking, more focused on the practical aspects of potential reunion. I've been thinking about what I would do if I could come back, he wrote in one letter. Banking is obviously out of the question, my license was revoked as part of the plea agreement. But I've been taking some courses in library science, and I've discovered that I actually enjoy organizing information and helping people find resources. It's a different kind of service than what I provided at the bank, but it's still meaningful. His letters also addressed the emotional aspects of potential reunion, acknowledging the challenges we would face in rebuilding our relationship. I know that coming back won't erase the past, he wrote. There's been too much hurt, too much separation for that. But I hope we can build something new, not the family we were before all this happened, but a new version of our family that incorporates everything we've learned and experienced. The holiday season felt different this year, filled with a sense of anticipation that hadn't been present in previous years. As we decorated the house, the girls talked about what it would be like to have David home for Christmas next year. Do you think he'll remember how we always make hot chocolate and watch It's a Wonderful Life on Christmas Eve? Isabella asked as she hung an ornament on the tree. I think he remembers everything about us, I replied, my heart aching at the thought of all the holidays and special occasions he had missed. Sophia, who had been quietly observing, added her own thoughts. It's going to be weird, isn't it? Having him back after so long. We've gotten used to it being just the three of us. It will be an adjustment, I acknowledged. But a good one, I hope. As winter gave way to spring, marking 2.5 years since David's departure, we received the official notification we had been waiting for. David's supervised release terms had been modified, allowing for relocation to a less restrictive environment with the possibility of eventual return to Sacramento under specific conditions. The transition would happen in stages. First, a move to a larger city with more anonymity, then increased communication and visitation flexibility, and finally, if all went well, a return to our area under a new identity with continued security protocols. The news was both exciting and terrifying. After more than 2 years of separation, the prospect of having David back in our daily lives brought a complicated mix of emotions that we each processed in our own ways. Sophia, who would be leaving for college in the fall, had mixed feelings about the timing. I'm happy he's coming back, but it's weird that I'll be leaving just as he's returning. We'll have missed so much time together. Isabella, who would be starting her sophomore year of high school, was simply overjoyed at the prospect of her father's return. I can't wait to show him my new artwork, to have him come to my soccer games, to just have him here for normal stuff. My own feelings were the most complicated. The thought of David's return brought joy, certainly, but also anxiety about how we would navigate the transition from separation to reunion, how we would rebuild the trust that had been broken, how we would create a new version of our family that incorporated everything we had learned and experienced. The first stage of David's transition happened in late spring. He relocated from the small mountain cabin to a medium-sized city in a neighboring state, where he would have more freedom of movement and communication while still maintaining certain security protocols. We were able to visit him twice over the summer in a setting that felt more normal than the previous supervised visits. We met in restaurants and parks, did touristy things together, gradually relearning how to be a family in public spaces after years of separation. The visits were both wonderful and strange, wonderful because we were creating new memories together, strange because David was both familiar and different, the man we had loved for more than 2 decades but also someone who had been shaped by experiences we couldn't fully understand. As August approached, bringing Sophia's departure for college and the next stage of David's transition, our lives felt increasingly in flux. The family we had become during David's absence was about to change again, evolving into something new that would incorporate both our past and our future. On Sophia's last night before leaving for college, we sat together in the living room, the familiar space filled with boxes and packing materials. "It's weird to think that when I come home for Thanksgiving, Dad might be here," Sophia said, her voice thoughtful. "It's what I've wanted for so long, but now that it's actually happening, it feels complicated." "I know what you mean," I replied. "Change is always complicated, even when it's change we've been hoping for." Isabella, who had been quietly listening, added her perspective. "I think it's like my art teacher says, when you're working on a piece that's been damaged, you have to decide whether to try to repair it so it looks exactly like it did before, or to embrace the damage and make it part of the new creation." The wisdom of her observation struck me deeply. Our family had been damaged, there was no denying that. But perhaps the goal wasn't to return to exactly what we had been before, but to create something new that incorporated the damage, the healing, the growth we had all experienced during our separation. As I tucked Sophia into bed that night, a ritual from her childhood that she still indulged me in on special occasions, I thought about the journey that had brought us to this moment. 23 years of marriage, 2 decades of building a life together, raising children, creating a home, all of it had been tested in ways I never could have imagined when I stood beside David at the altar and promised to love him for better or for worse. The worse had been more challenging than I could have anticipated, but it had also revealed strengths in myself and our daughters that I might never have discovered otherwise. We had faced the unthinkable and survived, not just survived but found ways to thrive, to create a new version of family that was different but not lesser than what we had before. The next morning, as we loaded Sophia's belongings into the car for the drive to her college campus, David called. His relocation to Sacramento had been approved, and he would be arriving in 2 weeks. The timing felt both perfect and terrible. Perfect because David would be there when Sophia returned for her first holiday break, terrible because he would miss this important milestone in her life. "I'm so proud of you, Sophia," David said, his voice thick with emotion over the phone. "I wish I could be there to see you off, but I'll be thinking of you every day. Call me when you get there, okay? I want to hear all about it." As we drove away from the house, leaving Isabella with neighbors who would watch her until our return, I thought about the cycles of separation and reunion that had defined our family for the past 2.5 years. Each departure had been painful, each reunion joyful, each transition an opportunity for growth and reinvention. Whatever the future held, we would face it as a family, not the traditional family we had once been, perhaps, but a family nonetheless, connected by love that transcended distance and circumstances, bound by the shared history that had shaped us all.